I don't like buses. I spent a disproportionate amount of time on buses over the past few years. I don't have a car, so buses are the only way I can get around. And I've spent a large portion of my life sitting in a bus seat. But that doesn't mean I like them. In particular, I really don't like school buses at all. The first time I ever experienced racism that I could really tell was racism was on a school bus. I was sitting towards the front of the bus, doing nothing, chewing on a pencil, as a 10-year-old tends to do, and I made eye contact with this kid I had never seen, never talked to before in my life. And he got up out of his seat, came up to the front of the bus, and sat next to me. He said to me, "Weak to play football or lacrosse, you're too dumb to join chess club or math club, and you'll never be anything, ever. This is you. That's what you look like." My first instinct was to cry, which I did for a very long time. Very, very long time. But after that passed, I actually started asking myself, where did the hate in his eyes come from? It seemed like he treated me the way you would treat someone you were at war with, the way you would treat an enemy. And it certainly didn't have anything to do with me. Sure, there's talks of transgenerational trauma coming down from people who experience horrible events being passed down to their children, their grandchildren. So maybe the same was true for the people who exert that trauma, for the people who do those things to those people. That got me thinking, what did his ancestors do to my ancestors when we were actually at war? What was it like to live in this country and look like the enemy?
I wanted to learn just how far back this racism went, so I did some research. I found that the normalization of casual racism and discrimination against the Japanese began before the United States was even involved in World War II. Racist comics, skewed reporting, and a general disdain towards people who looked different fueled the transition of intolerance into everyday conversation. Contrary to opinions claiming that Pearl Harbor was responsible for the backlash against the Japanese, there were clear discriminatory precedents in the United States history.
There was anti-Chinese agitation. They were run out of Tacoma. Many of them, there was a lynching in California. They couldn't bring the Chinese back for cheap labor, so they brought in Japanese. And so the Japanese inherited that same anti-Chinese, anti-Asian, yellow peril kind of feelings.
The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 brought the idea of discrimination against Asians into the mainstream. The Asian Exclusion Act of 1924 completely banned the immigration of Asians.
I mean, there's very normalized and rampant discrimination towards Japanese Americans, immigrants, or their children.
By the time World War II began, Asians were already the enemy, subhuman and alien. All that was needed was the final straw, one last push that would justify any injustices conducted in the name of revenge.
From the NBC newsroom in New York, President Roosevelt said in a statement today that the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii from the air. I'll repeat that. President Roosevelt says that the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii from the air.
We will interrupt all programs to give you latest news bulletins. Stay tuned to this station.
They are called Nisei. They are Americans. Most are American citizens by birth. There is no proven guilt, not even a proven military need. Yet respected public officials, the Army, the President of the United States, unite to imprison these fellow Americans without trial or hearing, and the Supreme Court approves.
On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, forcing 120,000 people of Japanese heritage into American concentration camps throughout the West.
There was an executive order posted on the telephone pole saying that the president has put in an order for all Japanese, whether you're American citizens or not, have to go to camp.
Being 13 years old, I said to myself, I was born in the U.S. and I'm an American citizen, and how could they do that to me?
You are just almost like an outsider, and oftentimes we were treated like foreigners, and we're treated like foreigners in our own country.
They had to abandon most of their possessions and properties, bringing only what they could carry in their arms.
My parents had a grocery store, and they had only 7 days to pack up everything or sell it for almost nothing.
Oh, they said, that's what you can carry, what you can't carry much. So we took all the clothes that we could take, and then we wore a skirt or pants underneath, so that we wore a couple, 3 things, so that we could have more. They said, you have to go, so we just went.
The Americanism of the great majority of America's Japanese finds its highest expression in the thousands who were in the United States Army.
Some Japanese citizens, hoping to prove their loyalty as Americans, volunteered to join the 442nd, a unit famed and highly decorated during World War II for carrying out highly dangerous missions.
For some of the older people, like 18 or 19, it was a place where they had to confront the issue of, will I fight for America? They put us into this camp. Should I volunteer and fight for America? And some said yes, and some said no.
They know what they're fighting against, and they know what they're fighting for.
There's a very strong sense of we need to prove our loyalty by going along with this and being as patriotic and as American as possible, which you see in terms of the 442nd Regiment and also even the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, their stance encouraging people to follow along with the executive order.
Attitudes within the camps remained mixed. To the American public, the concentration camps were advertised as a symptom of war, with smiling Japanese citizens praising their American opportunities,
Getting along with their employers, fellow workers, and neighbors, and finding satisfaction in becoming self-supporting once more.
Regardless of the image presented to the rest of the world, 120,000 Japanese American citizens remained confined in the camps for the next 3 years.
Hello, please. Master shooting the rope right in the center of the middle, just like the Lone Ranger. I did it!
Outside the camps, racism against Japanese people was widespread and accepted. Publications released vicious illustrations of scheming Japanese villains. Posters calling for the purchase of war bonds in order to push back the evil rising sun were on every bulletin board. Even children's cartoons depicted Japanese soldiers as bumbling idiots speaking poor English.
That's all right. Happy cherry blossoms to you, please.
Discrimination against the Japanese as a part of American culture was so prominent that clear, vocal distinctions between Chinese and Japanese people had to be made in order to protect the Chinese from similar treatment. Chinese citizens like my grandfather had to wear pins or put up signs in their stores that explicitly said, "I am Chinese." Life magazine, following the trend, published a slurry of now offensive anti-Japanese content in efforts to boost war morale. The depictions were graphic, exaggerated, and extremely racist. The cartoons and the ideas they reinforced worked so well to incite anger and fear in American citizens that they actually had to include a guide in one of their issues differentiating between Chinese and Japanese people. Unfortunately, it didn't work so well in practice.
They say bad things about being a Jap or something like that, or even Chink, you know. Everybody, white people or black people, they comment on your discriminating. and you can't get away from it, even today.
In January of 1945, the final camp was shut down, and the last group of incarcerated Japanese citizens was released. But the world they came back to was drastically different from the one they were initially sealed off from. For starters, they had nothing. Most goods and properties owned by Japanese citizens were either auctioned off, ransacked, or bought for dirt cheap.
I think it was more traumatic for our parents who had to give up their businesses, and they worked so hard to establish their place in America.
But my family was forced to leave their home. Unfortunately, also, that house, since they were renting it from a Chinese family, there's no way that a family could keep renting it to them for all that time that they were gone. So, of course, when they came back, it had already been rented to somebody else. So they lost their home.
My father was an independent grocer before the war. He and the other Japanese grocers got together and made a co-op. So he was a very successful businessman before the war. The war started, Pearl Harbor, they heard rumors, and his clientele, mostly white clients, stopped coming. And so he knew right away his business was over. And then shortly thereafter, they got the notice that they would be forcibly evacuated and incarcerated.
After the camps, the destruction of Japanese people's identities and livelihoods left many devastated.
They were all in various stages of grief, anger, denial.
The anguish of being released from camp without the opportunity to regain their work and their sense of purpose, it led some of them to commit suicide.
My father really lost his identity and could not recoup it. So here was this man who had dignity, he had a place in the community, and afterwards the only job he could get was a janitor's job, and they lived in a basement.
To make matters worse, despite their having done nothing besides stay confined behind fences for 3 years, the image of an evil, conniving Japanese enemy was still very fresh in the minds of many Americans.
Discrimination towards people of Japanese descent was very normalized. If you look at that cartoon by Dr. Seuss, you realize just how acceptable it is to say something so, provably false and slanderous towards a community. No, there's no repercussions for that.
People were treated like aliens and criminals in their own country during the war because they looked like the enemy. And after the war ended, this never really stopped.
The attitude was very much that it was acceptable and completely normal to hate Japanese and Japanese Americans and suspect them of being, traitors, even though no Japanese American was ever found guilty of treason.
There are actually at least 2 different Americas, and we lived in the one with less justice. We lived in the one where the Pledge of Allegiance didn't apply to us.
We wouldn't go to places where we thought we might be treated differently.
Just because we looked like the enemy.
My mother used to say, they sent us to this camp and we did not want to go. And when the war was over, they sent us home, but we had nowhere to go.
All of these people lived here legally, ran businesses, even fought and died for this country, and were still treated like foreigners because they looked like the enemy. But why? Was it because of fear, hatred, even profit?
Labor organizations and people in the military, they built movements and careers out of hating immigrants. And businessmen also profited from bashing them.
Bellevue Square in downtown Bellevue was Japanese strawberry farmland before the war. And because they left, it was purchased very cheaply, and the person who bought it also did anti-Japanese agitation to promote their incarceration. He bought the land And now you have Bellevue Square in downtown Bellevue.
The long-term effects on the Japanese, those most adversely affected, became painfully obvious as time progressed.
There's a prevalence in them of psychosomatic symptoms and ulcers and depression, and the former internees, both Issei and Nisei, had double the risk of cardiovascular illness and mortality. Well, they died 1.6 years earlier on average than their non-interned Japanese American counterparts in Hawaii.
The trauma from being imprisoned simply because of their race became a theme in Nisei families, passed down in one form or another as shame, guilt, or even mental illness.
I wasn't locked up. My mother wasn't locked up, but grandmother was. And I think there's a deep sense of shame that she felt that she passed on.
When you're a victim like that, oftentimes you just are silent. You don't want to say anything because you think you deserved it, or you think you brought it on yourself. Either that or you go into denial. It didn't happen, or it wasn't that bad.
I guess we just went along with the parents, and we didn't have any discrimination.
I myself didn't feel the antagonism.
I don't know that they were racist. I didn't think so. I mean, there's no reason for them to.
I can't remember. I think the whole thing was
just a lot of shame and humiliation, and it's been likened to the impact of rape survivors, where they feel like they're responsible for something that happened to them that truly has nothing to do with them. It's not their fault at all.
They are not prisoners. They are not internees. They are merely dislocated people, the unwounded casualties of war.
You have to face up to the fact that it was bad. It was a betrayal by your own government of your citizenship. Your own government turned against you and threw you in jail because of your race. And what I contend is that there are two Americas, and we lived in the one with less justice. And when I tell my stories about less justice and looking like the enemy, and people say, oh no, that isn't how it is, or that wasn't how it was, it doesn't tell anything about the truth as I see it. It only tells me which America they live in.
As Asians desperately tried to blend in and assimilate, racist depictions subtly continued throughout the media.
Good night.
Even after World War II movies, the same slant-eyed, sneaky, fanatical Japanese stereotype was reincarnated as the Chinese, red Chinese in the movies. And then it became the Vietnamese, same image. So World War II, in my mind, went on for 20, 25 years in the movies.
Blind Maya, the kid from Green Day.
See, here's a good example. Two brothers, one speaks no English, the other learned how to speak English from watching the wide world of sports. So you tell me, which is better, speaking no English at all or speaking Howard Cosell?
And you know what he's capable of.
Mr. Go right three. Someday, Mr. Go right three.
What I really would like to do is to be able to walk down the street and feel like I belonged in this country. And I can't do that, in my mind, because of the color of my skin and the slant of my eyes.
The legacy of Japanese incarceration and the factors leading up to it still remain. The dangers of propaganda, greed, and the general exploitation of fear are still incredibly prominent.
And so those three things, racial discrimination, wartime hysteria, and failed leadership, are still present. And I think they're present in a larger way than they were just a few years ago. And that's why it really raises concern over it happening again. It will not happen to Japanese again, but it will happen, I predict, to some other group.
I'd say in a lot of ways it does boil down to a problem of education and teaching people about history and not being able to recognize signs that we are normalizing hate towards towards minority groups, towards immigrants, or towards American Muslims, or towards Latinx immigrants. You have to teach people this history so that they can recognize the signs. And that's something that, especially the Japanese American incarceration history, it's a shameful part of our history, but that's exactly why we need to remember it.
The internment camps weren't just about moving Japanese people. It was much bigger than that. It was about rationalizing, legalizing, and normalizing the dehumanization of an entire group of people, an entire culture.
We didn't look like the enemy because there were Germans, Americans, who looked like the enemy. General Eisenhower, who became president, looked like the enemy. And we looked like an enemy, yes, but because of all the other agitation, we became the enemy. We became the enemy. And we were treated like the enemy. We were incarcerated. And that's the danger with the Muslims.
When you don't see those kind of patterns in history, see that kind of repetition, it's hard to understand the signs.
When you regard everyone the same, they look like the enemy.
And we have to be very careful about, even legitimizing it as a side in a debate. Legitimizing hate as, and giving it equal weight or credibility in a discussion is very dangerous.
You ask, can it happen again? Well, the factors are there, the mechanisms are there, and it was done by an executive order.
The clearly racist incarceration of Japanese Americans was unacceptable. It crippled an entire generation and left their descendants, me and others like me, open to that very same discrimination. In the face of history repeating itself, the need to speak out against greed, propaganda, and hysteria is clearer than ever.
If you choose to participate, that is your choice, but you cannot claim ignorance.
So if you want to be a good ally to someone, ask them, how can I be a good ally?
If you cannot go out and march, and if that's not your thing, go contribute to the ACLU, who will march for you.
I think in modern times, the overwhelming view is that this was a horrible injustice. But at the same time, we still have to keep teaching people about it, because otherwise, we could be headed down a dark path again.
As Japanese, we were the first taken. It's our legacy to stand should any other group be taken. And so we should be the first to stand. We should be the first to protest. And by me telling the story to people, and they hear it, they get a piece of that legacy.
I would never have imagined that 70 years later, after the camps closed, the idea that Asian people were stupid and evil would still be there, but it was there. It was there in the eyes of that kid on the bus. It was in his hateful stare and in his heart. I used to be afraid of riding on the bus. I used to be afraid to go to school. I used to be afraid of being Asian because it meant I would be hurt, but nobody should be afraid. Nobody should be afraid to ride the bus or go to school. Nobody should be afraid of discrimination because they look like the enemy, because the enemy isn't you or me. The enemy is fear. I know now that that kid on the bus wasn't just angry or hateful. He was afraid of me because I look different. And that fear is very old, very deep in our culture, but it's not set in stone. There are ways to fight back against that fear through
writing, activism, even just calling it out. And even though this terrible thing has already happened to the Japanese, the Chinese, my ancestors, and me, we can stop it from happening again. Doesn't matter if you're black, white, Japanese, Chinese, Muslim. If we stand together, not as a race, not as groups or ethnicities, but as people, we don't have to be afraid anymore.
What's happening, hot stuff?
His name is Long Duck Dong.
We have new information now also on the plane crash. KTVU has just learned the names of the 4 pilots who were on board the flight. They are Captain Sum Ting Wong, Wee Tu Lo, Ho Li Fook, and Bang Ding Ao.
And the Jedi?
Kill them immediately.
Yes, my lord. As you wish.